Michelle Nyce looked like she had everything a woman could dream of. She lived in a big, beautiful house in Hopewell Township, New Jersey. The house sat on many acres of land with green grass and tall trees everywhere. Her husband, Jonathan, was a very smart scientist who had made millions of dollars from his work with medicines. People in their neighborhood thought they were the perfect couple. Michelle was 34 years old and came from the Philippines. She had moved to America hoping for a better life. When she first met Jonathan, he seemed like her Prince Charming. He was older than her by 20 years, but he was successful and seemed to care about her very much. Jonathan showered her with gifts and promised her a life of comfort and happiness. For a while, it seemed like all her dreams were coming true, but things started to change after they got married. Jonathan began to act strange. At first, Michelle thought he was just being protective. He would ask her where she was going and who she was meeting. He wanted to know everything about her day. Michelle thought this was sweet at first because it showed he cared about her. She did not realize that this was just the beginning of something much worse. As months passed, Jonathan became more and more controlling. He would check her phone when she was not looking. He would go through her purse and read her personal things. If Michelle wanted to go somewhere, Jonathan would ask her many questions. Who was she going with? What time would she be back? Why did she need to go there? Sometimes he would say no, and Michelle would have to stay home. Jonathan also became very jealous. If Michelle talked to any man, even just to be polite, Jonathan would get angry. He would accuse her of flirting or trying to meet other men. Michelle started to feel scared to talk to anyone because she did not want Jonathan to get upset. She began to avoid going to places where there might be other people. The house that once felt like a palace started to feel like a prison. Jonathan put cameras around their property. He said it was for security, but Michelle knew he was watching her. She felt like she could never be alone or have any privacy. Even when Jonathan was at work, she felt like he was still watching her somehow. Michelle tried to talk to Jonathan about how she was feeling. She told him that his behavior was making her unhappy and scared. But Jonathan would get angry when she brought it up. He would yell at her and say that she was being ungrateful. He would remind her of all the nice things he had given her and say that she should be happy. Sometimes he would say that if she did not like it, she could leave. But Michelle knew that leaving would not be easy. Jonathan had control of all their money. Michelle did not have her own bank account or credit cards. She did not have a job because Jonathan said wives should not work. This meant that if she wanted to leave, she would have no money to live on. She also did not have many friends because Jonathan had made it difficult for her to keep friendships. He did not like her friends and would complain when they called or visited. Michelle started to notice that Jonathan had a very bad temper. When things did not go the way he wanted, he would become very angry very quickly. He would throw things and slam doors. He would shout and say mean things to Michelle. Sometimes Michelle was afraid that Jonathan might hurt her physically, but he never did. At least not yet. The friends that Michelle still had contact with began to notice changes in her. She seemed sad and nervous all the time. She would jump when her phone rang, worried that it might be Jonathan checking on her. When friends asked her if everything was okay, Michelle would say yes, but they could tell something was wrong. She had bruises sometimes that she said were from accidents, but her friends started to wonder if that was really true. Michelle began to realize that her marriage was not what she had hoped for. The man she had married was not the same person she was now living with. Jonathan had become someone who scared her and made her feel trapped. She started to think about leaving, but she did not know how. She had no money, no job, and nowhere to go. She was far from her family in the Philippines, and she felt very alone. Slowly, Michelle started to make small plans. She began to hide small amounts of money when she could. She kept important papers in a secret place. She started to think about who she could call for help if she needed to leave quickly. But Michelle had to be very careful because if Jonathan found out what she was planning, she knew he would be very angry. The couple had started sleeping in different bedrooms. They barely talked to each other anymore unless Jonathan was asking her questions about where she had been or what she had been doing. The house felt cold and empty. even though it was filled with expensive furniture and beautiful things. Michelle felt like she was living with a stranger who watched her every move. Michelle did not know that Jonathan was becoming more and more suspicious of her. He had hired private detectives to follow her when she left the house. He was reading her emails and listening to her phone calls. His jealousy was growing stronger every day, and he was starting to believe that Michelle was planning to leave him for another man. What Michelle also did not know was that Jonathan was capable of violence. Behind his calm appearance as a successful scientist, there was a man who could become very dangerous when he felt threatened. Michelle thought she understood how bad things were, but she had no idea that her husband was about to do something that would change everything forever. The perfect life that Michelle had dreamed of was about to become her worst nightmare, and there would be no waking up from what was coming next. January 16, 2004 started like any other day in the Nyce house. Michelle woke up feeling the same heaviness in her chest that she felt every morning. She knew Jonathan would be watching her, asking questions, and checking on everything she did. But this day was going to be different from all the others. This would be the day that changed everything forever. Earlier that week, Michelle had been talking to a young man named Clyde Miller. Clyde worked at a tanning salon that Michelle sometimes visited. He was only 20 years old, much younger than Michelle, and he was kind to her. When Michelle felt sad or lonely, she would sometimes send text messages to Clyde. She was not interested in him as anything more than a friend, but talking to him made her feel a little less alone. Clyde would listen to Michelle when she told him about her problems at home. He was one of the few people who knew how unhappy she was in her marriage. Michelle felt safe talking to him because he was just a friend who cared about her feelings. She never thought that these innocent conversations would put her life in danger, but Jonathan had been watching Michelle more closely than she realized. He had ways of checking her phone messages that she did not know about. When he found the text messages between Michelle and Clyde, his worst fears seemed to come true. In his mind, these friendly messages were proof that Michelle was having an affair with another man. Jonathan had always been jealous, but this discovery made him angrier than he had ever been before. He spent the whole day thinking about the messages and getting more and more upset. By the time evening came, Jonathan was filled with rage. He could not stop thinking about Michelle talking to another man. He could not stand the thought that she might want to leave him for someone else. That evening, Jonathan confronted Michelle about the messages. He demanded to know why she was talking to Clyde and what she was planning to do. Michelle tried to explain that Clyde was just a friend and that the messages meant nothing romantic. She told Jonathan that she was lonely and just needed someone to talk to. But Jonathan did not believe her. The argument quickly became worse than any fight they had ever had before. Jonathan was shouting and accusing Michelle of lying to him. He said terrible things to her and called her names. Michelle tried to defend herself, but Jonathan would not listen to anything she said. His jealousy had taken over his mind completely. Michelle became scared when she saw the look in Jonathan's eyes. She had seen him angry before, but this was different. There was something dangerous about the way he was looking at her. She tried to walk away from him and go to another room, but Jonathan followed her. He would not let her escape from the argument. The fight moved from room to room as Jonathan continued to yell at Michelle. She kept trying to calm him down and explain that he was wrong about Clyde, but nothing she said made any difference. Jonathan had convinced himself that Michelle was betraying him, and he could not think clearly anymore. Then Jonathan remembered the baseball bat that he kept next to their bed. He had bought it months ago and said it was for protection in case anyone broke into their house. But now, in his anger and jealousy, Jonathan saw the bat as a way to hurt Michelle. He went to get it while Michelle was still trying to talk to him. When Michelle saw Jonathan pick up the baseball bat, she knew she was in serious danger. She tried to run away from him, but there was nowhere to go. The house that had been her prison for so long was now going to be the place where her life would end. She begged Jonathan to put down the bat and talk to her calmly, but he was beyond reasoning. Jonathan raised the bat above his head and struck Michelle with all his strength. The blow hit her head and she fell to the floor immediately. Michelle did not make another sound after that. She lay very still on the floor while Jonathan stood over her, breathing heavily and still holding the bat. For a moment, Jonathan just stared at what he had done. The house was completely quiet except for the sound of his own heartbeat. Michelle was not moving at all. The woman he had claimed to love was lying motionless on the floor, and it was his fault. As the minutes passed, Jonathan began to realize what had happened. He had killed his wife in a moment of jealous rage. The anger that had been building up inside him for months had finally exploded, and now Michelle was dead. But instead of feeling sorry for what he had done or calling for help, Jonathan's mind started working on a different problem. Jonathan was a scientist who was used to solving difficult problems. Even though he had just committed murder, his brain began to think about how to get away with it. He started to plan how he could hide what he had done and make it look like Michelle's death was not his fault. The loving husband that Michelle had married was completely gone now. In his place was a cold, calculating man who cared more about saving himself than about the woman he had just killed. Jonathan looked down at Michelle's body and began to think about what he would do next. He knew that he had to move quickly. People would start looking for Michelle soon, and he needed to have a story ready. Jonathan began to clean up the blood and hide the evidence of what had really happened in his house that night. The cover-up was about to begin, and Jonathan was determined to make sure that no one would ever know the truth about how Michelle had died. Jonathan stood in his living room looking at Michelle's body on the floor. His wife was dead and he had killed her. But instead of calling the police or an ambulance, Jonathan was thinking about how to hide his crime. His scientific mind was already working on a plan to make sure no one would ever know what really happened that night. The first thing Jonathan had to do was clean up all the blood. He went to the kitchen and got cleaning supplies, paper towels, and bleach. He worked quickly and carefully to remove every trace of blood from the floor and walls. Jonathan knew that blood could be found by police even when it looked like it was all cleaned up, so he had to be very thorough. After cleaning the blood, Jonathan knew he had to get rid of the baseball bat. This was the weapon he had used to kill Michelle, and it could not stay in the house. He wrapped the bat in plastic bags and put it in his car. Later, he would throw it away somewhere far from his house where no one would ever find it. But Jonathan's biggest problem was Michelle's body. He could not leave her in the house because that would make it obvious that she had been murdered there. He had to move her somewhere else and make it look like she had died in a different place. This was going to be the hardest part of his plan. Jonathan was strong enough to carry Michelle, but it was not easy. She was heavy, and he had to be careful not to leave any evidence on her body that would show she had been moved. He wrapped her in blankets and plastic to make sure no blood or other evidence would get in his car. It was very dark outside, which was good for Jonathan. None of his neighbors could see what he was doing. He put Michelle's body in the back of his car and drove away from his house. Jonathan had already decided where he was going to put her. There was a small creek that ran through some woods not far from their home. The water was cold in January, and Jonathan thought this would help destroy evidence. Jonathan carried Michelle's body to the creek and put her in the cold water. He arranged her body to make it look like she might have fallen and hit her head on the rocks. Jonathan hoped that when someone found her, they would think her death was an accident. He also hoped that being in the water would wash away any evidence that could connect her death to him. After putting Michelle in the creek, Jonathan drove home and continued with his plan. He had to make it look like he had no idea what had happened to his wife. He needed to act like a worried husband whose wife had suddenly disappeared. Jonathan went back into his house and cleaned everything one more time. He made sure there was no sign that anything bad had happened there. Then he sat down and started calling Michelle's phone. He left message after message asking where she was and when she was coming home. Jonathan made his voice sound worried and scared, like a husband who was concerned about his missing wife. These phone calls were very important to Jonathan's plan. When the police investigated Michelle's disappearance, they would hear these messages. The messages would make it seem like Jonathan had no idea where Michelle was, and that he was very worried about her safety. Jonathan also called some of Michelle's friends and family members. He asked them if they had seen Michelle or if they knew where she might be. Again, he made himself sound like a very worried husband. Some of the people he called could hear the concern in his voice, and they believed that Jonathan was genuinely scared for Michelle's safety. The next morning, Jonathan called the police to report that his wife was missing. When the police officers came to his house, Jonathan was ready for them. He had his story prepared and he knew exactly what to say. Jonathan told the police that he and Michelle had gotten into an argument the night before. He said that Michelle had left the house angry and had never come home. He explained that this was not like her and that he was very worried something bad had happened to her. The police officers who came to Jonathan's house thought he seemed like a genuinely concerned husband. He was cooperative and answered all their questions. He let them search his house and look through Michelle's belongings. Jonathan was not acting like someone who had anything to hide. Jonathan's story was simple and believable. He told the police that Michelle had been unhappy in their marriage and that she had been talking to other men. He suggested that she might have gone to meet someone and that something bad might have happened to her. Jonathan was careful not to directly accuse Michelle of having an affair, but he planted the idea in the police officers' minds. The police took Jonathan's report seriously and began looking for Michelle. They put out a missing person alert and started checking places where she might have gone. Jonathan watched all of this happen and felt confident that his plan was working. For several days, Jonathan continued to act like a worried husband. He talked to reporters and asked the public to help find his wife. He put up missing person posters with Michelle's picture on them. Everyone who saw Jonathan during this time believed that he was a loving husband who just wanted his wife to come home safely. But while Jonathan was putting on this act for everyone else, he was also watching the police investigation very carefully. He wanted to make sure that they were not getting too close to discovering what had really happened. Jonathan knew that if the police found any evidence that connected him to Michelle's death, his carefully planned cover-up would fall apart. Detective Daniel McKeown had been working missing person cases for many years, but something about Michelle Nyce's disappearance bothered him from the very beginning. When Jonathan first reported his wife missing, McKeown thought he seemed like a worried husband. But as days passed and more information came to light, the detective started to have doubts about Jonathan's story. The first thing that made McKeown suspicious was how calm Jonathan seemed to be. Most husbands whose wives disappeared would be much more upset and frantic. Jonathan was certainly acting worried, but there was something about his behavior that did not seem quite right. He seemed too controlled, too prepared for all the questions that people were asking him. A few days after Michelle was reported missing, police found her car in a shopping center parking lot about 5 miles from the Nyce house. This discovery immediately made the case more serious. The car was locked and Michelle's purse was still inside with her wallet, credit cards, and identification. Her cell phone was also in the car, along with some personal items. McKeown knew that if Michelle had left home voluntarily, she would not have abandoned her car with all her important belongings inside. This meant that either something bad had happened to Michelle, or someone wanted it to look like something bad had happened to her. Either way, this was no longer just a missing person case. The detective began interviewing people who knew Michelle. He talked to her friends, family members, and people she had worked with in the past. What McKeown learned from these conversations painted a very different picture of the Nyce marriage than what Jonathan had been telling everyone. Michelle's friends told McKeown that she had been unhappy and scared for months before she disappeared. They said that Jonathan was very controlling, and that Michelle felt like a prisoner in her own home. Several people told the detective about bruises they had seen on Michelle and about how frightened she seemed to be of her husband. One of Michelle's closest friends told McKeown that Michelle had been planning to leave Jonathan. She had been saving money and making secret preparations to get away from him. The friend said that Michelle was terrified of what Jonathan might do if he found out about her plans to leave. This information made McKeown realize that Jonathan had not been telling the truth about his marriage. Instead of being a loving, worried husband, Jonathan was starting to look like a man who had good reasons to want his wife to disappear. The detective decided to look more closely at Jonathan's story and see if he could find any holes in it. McKeown and his team began checking Jonathan's timeline for the night Michelle disappeared. They looked at phone records, credit card transactions, and security camera footage from businesses near the Nyce house. What they found was that some parts of Jonathan's story did not match the evidence. Jonathan had said that Michelle left the house around 8 p.m. after their argument, but phone records showed that Michelle's cell phone had stopped being used much earlier than that. There were also no security camera images of Michelle's car driving around town that evening, which there should have been if she had really left home when Jonathan said she did. The biggest breakthrough in the case came when McKeown discovered the text messages between Michelle and Clyde Miller. When the detective interviewed Clyde, the young man was very helpful and honest about his friendship with Michelle. Clyde explained that Michelle had been reaching out to him because she was lonely and scared at home. Clyde showed McKeown all the messages that Michelle had sent him. The detective could see that these were just friendly conversations between two people, and that Michelle was not having a romantic relationship with Clyde. But McKeown also realized that if Jonathan had seen these messages, he might have thought something different was happening. This gave McKeown a clear motive for Jonathan to hurt Michelle. The detective now believed that Jonathan had discovered the messages, become jealous and angry, and done something terrible to his wife. All McKeown needed now was to find evidence that proved Jonathan was lying about what happened that night. King D. Detective decided to search the Nyce house more carefully. The first search had been done quickly when Michelle was just reported missing, but now McKeown had a search warrant that allowed him to look for evidence of a crime. The detective and his team spent hours going through every room in the house. Even though Jonathan had cleaned very carefully, McKeown's team found tiny traces of blood in places that Jonathan had missed. They found blood on the bottom of a chair leg and in small cracks in the wooden floor. When these blood samples were tested, they matched Michelle's blood type. The team also found evidence that someone had done a lot of cleaning recently. There were empty bottles of bleach and other cleaning products that had been used up. The floors and walls had been scrubbed so hard that some of the paint was worn away in places. This was not the kind of normal cleaning that people do in their homes. McKeown also discovered that Jonathan had been watching and following Michelle for months before she disappeared. He had hired private investigators to spy on her, and he had installed hidden cameras around their property. Jonathan's computer showed that he had been checking Michelle's email and text messages without her knowledge. All of this evidence showed that Jonathan was not the loving, trusting husband he pretended to be. Instead, he was a jealous, controlling man who had been spying on his wife and who had good reasons to be angry with her. McKeown now had motive, opportunity, and physical evidence that connected Jonathan to Michelle's disappearance. But the detective still needed to find Michelle's body to prove that she was really dead, and not just missing. McKeown organized search teams to look in areas around the Nyce house. They searched fields, woods, and waterways, hoping to find some trace of Michelle. The detective felt that finding Michelle's body was the key to solving the case and getting justice for her. 3 weeks after Michelle Nyce disappeared, a man walking his dog near a creek found something terrible. The dog had run ahead and started barking at something in the water. When the man went to see what his dog was barking at, he found Michelle's body floating in the cold creek water. The man immediately called the police. Detective McKeown rushed to the scene with his team and the medical examiner. Even though Michelle's body had been in the water for weeks, the cold January weather had helped preserve evidence that would be important for the case. The medical examiner carefully examined Michelle's body at the scene and later during an autopsy. The examination showed that Michelle had died from a severe blow to her head. The injury was too serious to have been caused by accidentally falling and hitting her head on rocks, as Jonathan had hoped people would believe. The medical examiner found that Michelle had been struck with a heavy object like a baseball bat. The force of the blow was so strong that it had caused immediate death. There were no other injuries on Michelle's body, which meant that she had not been in a fight or tried to defend herself. Someone had hit her once very hard when she was not expecting it. This medical evidence proved that Michelle had been murdered. She had not died in an accident, and she had not killed herself. Someone had deliberately attacked her with a weapon and killed her. Detective McKeown now had everything he needed to arrest Jonathan for murder. When the police came to arrest Jonathan, he seemed surprised and upset. He continued to claim that he had nothing to do with Michelle's death and that he was innocent. But Jonathan's act of being a worried husband was no longer working. Too much evidence pointed to him as the killer. Jonathan was charged with murder and taken to jail to wait for his trial. The news of his arrest shocked many people in the community, who had believed that he was a loving husband searching for his missing wife. But Michelle's friends and family were not surprised. They had always suspected that Jonathan was responsible for what happened to Michelle. The trial began several months later and attracted a lot of attention from newspapers and television news programs. People were fascinated by the story of a wealthy, educated man who had killed his wife in a jealous rage. The case had everything that made for an interesting news story: a beautiful victim, a successful suspect, and a shocking crime that happened behind the doors of a perfect-looking home. The prosecutor who handled the case was determined to get justice for Michelle. She presented evidence that showed how controlling and jealous Jonathan had been. She played recordings of the threatening voicemails that Jonathan had left on Michelle's phone and showed the jury text messages that proved how scared Michelle had been of her husband. The prosecutor also presented all the physical evidence that Detective McKeown had found. She showed the jury the blood evidence from the Nyce house and explained how Jonathan had tried to clean up after killing Michelle. She brought in experts who testified about the medical evidence and explained exactly how Michelle had died. Most importantly, the prosecutor was able to show the jury that Jonathan had lied about everything. His timeline did not match the evidence. His story about Michelle leaving the house voluntarily was proved false by phone records and other evidence. Everything Jonathan had told the police and the public about that night was a lie designed to cover up his crime. Jonathan's defense lawyers tried to argue that Michelle's death was an accident. They claimed that Jonathan and Michelle had been fighting, and that Jonathan had pushed her or hit her without meaning to kill her. They wanted the jury to believe that Jonathan was guilty of a lesser crime, not murder. But the prosecutor was able to prove that this was not true. The medical evidence showed that Michelle had been hit with tremendous force by someone who intended to hurt her very badly. This was not an accident or a moment of temporary anger. This was a deliberate attack by someone who wanted to kill. The jury listened to all the evidence for several weeks. They heard from witnesses who knew Michelle and Jonathan. They saw photographs from the crime scene and listened to expert testimony about the medical evidence. They also heard recordings of Jonathan's phone calls and saw copies of all the text messages between Michelle and Clyde. When it came time for the jury to make their decision, they did not take very long. After just a few hours of discussion, they returned to the courtroom with their verdict. They found Jonathan Nyce guilty of aggravated manslaughter, which is a very serious crime that carries a long prison sentence. The judge sentenced Jonathan to 30 years in prison. This meant that Jonathan would be an old man before he would have any chance of being released. The judge told Jonathan that his crime was especially terrible because he had killed someone who trusted him and who should have been safe in her own home. Michelle's family and friends were happy that Jonathan had been convicted and would go to prison for a long time. They felt that justice had been done for Michelle, even though nothing could bring her back or undo the terrible thing that had happened to her. The case of Michelle Nyce became an important reminder about domestic violence and how dangerous it can be. Michelle's story showed that abuse can happen in any family, even ones that look perfect from the outside. Her death helped other people understand the warning signs of domestic abuse and the importance of getting help before it is too late. Michelle had been a young woman who came to America hoping for a better life. Instead, she found herself trapped with a man who became more dangerous as time went on. Her story serves as a warning that money and success cannot hide an abusive and dangerous person. Michelle's death was a tragedy, but her memory lives on as a reminder to take domestic violence seriously and to help people who are trapped in dangerous relationships.